What's going on, people? This is Kish Yardi Nation Gaming or Kish Yardi views and vlogs, right? First of all, I love the comment section in my comments. Black Americans or FBA challenging me, and I have no problem looking up the information they put in there and to go looking up the truth to give me content to make. So this brother said that somebody by the name of James Webb, Morris Webb, influenced Marcus Garvey, and he had a lot of black Pan-African thought leaders in America during this time. And he talked about how James Webb, right, influenced Marcus Garvey. And I have no problem admitting the facts. And he is absolutely correct. James Webb did influence Marcus Garvey. Let's go into the information, right? James Webb, Morris Webb, sometimes listed as J.M. Webb, was an important early 20th century black religious and national thinker who helped shape ideas that later influenced groups such as the Nation of Islam and other forms of Afrocentric theology. Here's a breakdown of who he is and why he matters, right? Basic biography. James Morris Webb, this is where he's born, so I'm not going to read all this. Y'all can pause this and y'all can read it for yourselves, right? He wrote The Black Man, the Fall of Civilization, proven by biblical history, 1919. Remember, the UNIA, I think, started in the 1914, right? This book was a pioneering Afrocentric theological text that argued the original man and the civilization itself came from Africa. Biblical patriarchs and key ancient peoples were black. White supremacy and Eurocentric Christianity had distorted history to erase African origins. The black race was divinely chosen and destined to rise again. So now I want y'all to fully watch this video because a lot of you FBAs and even some of the Caribbean blacks that comment in my comment section, you don't watch the full video and then you stop at places and pick out and cherry pick what to pick where I said wrong to get me to a gotcha moment. But if you watch the full video to get the full context and the picture that I paint, now you have to argue from it. So, I know y'all got ADHD. I mean, I have ADHD, but I know I can watch a full-on video. But I know a lot of y'all attention span is short and it's difficult for you. But watch the entire video, please. Watch the entire video, right? The black race, right? So, right. Marcus Garvey, UNIA, Improvement Association, often referenced Webb's writings. His works influenced early Moorish Science Temple of America, thought, and later the Nation of Islam, both of which adopted the concept of the original black man and the divine black identity. He blended biblical interpretation, Afrocentric history, and moral uplift, encouraging black people to view themselves as the inheritors of divine civilization, not slaves or inferior, right? So Marcus Garvey, right, inspired by James Webb, influenced Noble Drew Lees and the Nation of Islam, right? I'm not going to take that away from James Webb. We give thanks to our fathers or forebearers that influenced us, right? And watch the next video I do. James Morris Webb was a forerunner to modern Afrocentric and black theological movements. He stood at the crossroads of Christian theology, Black nationalism, historical reclamation of African identity. Without Webb, much of the language of the original man, black God, and lost African civilizations used later by later movements like the Nation of Islam might not have existed in the same form, right? But just like if it was not for Marcus Garvey, you would not have a mass action movement. We're going to break it down. When James Morris Webb wrote, The Black Man, the Father of Civilization, proven by biblical history, his look to Africa vision didn't come from thin air. It emerged from fusion of biblical prophecy, Garveyian nationalism, and Pan-African historical revisionism that was growing among black thinkers at the time, right? So James Webb, even though he inspired Marcus Garvey, Garvey inspired him back. So it was constant innovation. He inspired Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey built the movement. Marcus Garvey inspired him back, right? So they're both working hand in hand. to fight European colonialism. The phrase "look to Africa for the coming of a black king" is most famously associated with Marcus Garvey, who declared it. Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near. However, Garvey wasn't the first to express that type of prophecy. He was echoing a spiritual and political movement that was already developing in circles of men like James Morris Webb and other early black nationalist preachers, right? Webb's interpretation of scripture. Webb's writings show that he drew from Old Testament prophecy, especially Psalms, Isaiah, and Daniel. Ethiopian biblical references, princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Psalm 68, verse 31. And you know that Ethiopia means the land of the black burnt faces, right? Afro-Israelites and Ethiopianist theology, which claim Africa was the birthplace of humankind and the origin of biblical civilization. In other words, Webb saw Africa as a prophetic center of God's plan, the future restoration of divine kingship and civilization. So the look to Africa idea for a coming black king was rooted in his biblical Africanism, not just racial pride, right? Ethiopianism and biblical prophecy of restoration in the late 18th century and early 1900s, a widespread movement known as Ethiopianism spread to black churches in Africa and the diaspora. It thought that Ethiopia symbolized all black people. The philosophy that Ethiopia shall stretch out our hand unto God meant Africa would rise again spiritually and politically. Webb, being a minister, absorbed Ethiopia's prophecy into his theology. So remember, Webb was being influenced by Africa and Ethiopia, and then he pushed that message, right? He believed that after centuries of oppression, a divine black ruler of civilization would reemerge in Africa, fulfilling God's plan. And when y'all say these things, you tell white people what's going to happen. And then what white people go do is they go strike that shit first and make sure it don't happen. When Garvey launched his UNI, Universal Negro Improvement Association, in 1914, so James Webb wrote his book in 1919. Marcus Garvey started his movement in 1914. And his followers often quoted or referenced the same biblical prophecies Webb used. Garvey himself admired ministers and thinkers like Webb. So Garvey made look to Africa into a global rallying cry. Webb had already been writing theologically foundations that identified Africa as Eden, black people as God's original civilization, a coming black king as a messianic figure. The connection, and what's wrong with the coming of a black king? If white people can have a white king or Jesus Christ, why we can't have one, right? That's the whole point about Marcus Garvey saying we must look to ourselves or look to a black deity as our redeemer instead of looking to a white man. I don't know why black people would get upset with that. Connection to the crowning of Haile Selassie. Later, when Haile Selassie I was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, many in the diaspora, especially in Jamaica, remembered Garvey's and Webb's words. Rastafarian interpreted as the literal fulfillment of the Black King prophecy, even though Webb had passed away before then. James Morris Webb got the idea of look to Africa for the Black King from his Ethiopianist reading of the Bible, which he fused with Pan-African political consciousness. He believed Africa was both the birthplace and the future throne of divine black rulership, a kingdom that would rise again after centuries of subjugation. Marcus Garvey version, 1914 to the 1920s. When Garvey founded the UNI, Universal Negro Improvement Association, in 1914 and began his Back to Africa movement, he took that spiritual vision and translated it into political and racial language. His famous quote around 1920 was, "Look to Africa, when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near." Garvey used that to symbolize African independence, self-rule, and the rise of black leadership worldwide. Not necessarily a literal biblical king, but a metaphor for racial redemption. So Garvey used it for something different than how James Webb used it. When Haile Selassie I became Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, many remembered Garvey's prophecy, especially in Jamaica. That's what sparked the Rastafarian movement, which reinterpreted Garvey's word literally and declared Haile Selassie as a prophesied black king. But by that time, Garvey's phase had already become global, and Webb's theological foundation had largely been forgotten by the masses. So it's like Moses was the prophet, and then Christ comes along after and fulfills that prophecy. So Garvey's fulfilling the prophecy of James Webb. Ethiopianism, Webb's core foundation. James Morris Webb was ultimately inspired by a religious political current called Ethiopianism, which began in the late 19th century among Black Christians in Africa and the Caribbean and the Americas. So James Webb was inspired by Black Christians in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. That's of course South America and Central America, right? So he was inspired by Caribbean niggas already. And I'm gonna do the next video I do. I'm gonna break down how a lot of Frederick Douglass, how he was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, and about a lot of the rebellions that took place in Jamaica. A lot of your white abolitionists like John Brown and Frederick Douglass, they was inspired by what was going on as far as slave rebellions in Jamaica was concerned. And I'm gonna bring that up, right? This single verse was treated as a prophecy that Africa, symbolized by Ethiopia, would rise again after centuries of slavery and colonization. Ethiopianism taught that Africa was the cradle of civilization. Africans were part of God's chosen people. A Black Masonic restoration would occur spiritually and culturally and politically. Webb absorbed this theology deeply. He just merged it with biblical archaeology, racial science, and historical argument to prove that Black people were literally the fathers of civilization. So Webb is taking bits and pieces from Africa, the Caribbean, and he's merging it into his own unique identity, innovation. Marcus Garvey comes along and is fulfilling what Webb is saying, right? It's like Kool Herc with hip hop. Kool Herc is taking elements that were already here in America and the elements he was already bringing from Jamaica and creating a new thing called hip hop, another column called hip hop. It's called innovation. Biblical prophetic lineage. Webb's look to Africa. Black King idea ultimately came from how those preachers interpreted it. Psalm 68:31. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Isaiah 18. Prophecy of a nation beyond the rivers is Ethiopia. Zephaniah 3, verse 10. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliant shall bring mine offering. These verses were spiritual DNA of Ethiopianism, passed down to Webb and then echoed by Garvey. So this is showing you how all of these things are being put together, right? Webb was also influenced by the Back to Africa discussion of this era. Liberia founding 1820 to 1840s, and the idea of a black homeland. And I believe that there was an offer to Black Americans to go back to Liberia or something like that. I might have to go look into that. The Pan-African Conference, 19 onward, early Garveyite and African Methodist, Episcopal AME networks, right? He stood at the bridge between religious prophecy and political nationalism. By the way, Marcus Garvey was a Sigma, right? James Morris Webb was already teaching before Garvey's rise. Webb had been lecturing and writing about the Black man's divine origins and African destiny since the 1910s. His major work, The Black Man, the Black Father of Civilization, proven by biblical history, was published in 1919. But his lecture and pamphlets go back earlier. In those writings, Webb clearly predicted the rise of a Black king in Africa and the return of Black civilization's glory. At this time, Garvey's UNIA, founded in Jamaica in 1914, was still small and not yet an international force. Garvey didn't begin making his famous Look to Africa statements until early 1920s. Years after Webb ideas were circulating, Garvey and Webb later crossed paths. Webb joined Garvey's movement. Webb eventually became involved in Garvey's UNIA, seeing it as a political vehicle for the same prophetic destiny he'd been preaching. He served as a minister and lecturer within the UNIA structure, using his biblical African teachings to reinforce Garvey's Back to Africa message. But the relationship was symbiotic. Garvey gave Webb theology and political platform, while Webb gave Garvey's movement religious depth and spiritual legitimacy. So it's two things, two identities, two brothers, two cousins, merging the shit together to form nigga Voltron, nigga Optimus Prime, the ultimate nigga Transformer, the ultimate nigga Super Saiyan, the ultimate nigga whatever you want to call it. What did Garvey do before Black Americans? He built a truly global Black movement, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Jamaica in 1914 before he ever set foot in the United States. Unlike early leaders, he built a mass organization with chapters across Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and North America, making him the first Black leader to unite the African diaspora under one banner. Right? So, let me read that. Unlike early leaders, he built a mass organization with chapters across Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, and North America, making him the first Black leader to unite the African diaspora under one banner. The Black Star Line. He created the Black Star Line steamship company in 1919 to link Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas to Black-owned trade and travel. No African-American leader before him had launched an international maritime enterprise meant to serve both symbolic and economic liberation. Why would any Black person disagree with this? All the shit we talk about, generational wealth, having our own shit in entrepreneurship. Could you imagine if this Black Star Line steamship company, and what would it be like today if Black people had carried this through, even after Garvey's deportation? Could you just fucking imagine? We wouldn't have to be begging government today for fucking food stamps because we'd have our own Black Star Line. Jamaica and the Caribbean, they can produce food, agriculture. America could be the Black Americans, and it could be a whole trade back and forth, economy, food, and we can support each other while supporting the larger global space. And we wouldn't need to beg nothing from white people. But it's always some Negroes in the movement fucking it up because they love the white man too much. Could you just imagine that instead of Black people begging in America for SNAP and EBT, that a Black Star Line steamship company from Jamaica and the Caribbean was sending food to Black America? And just like with the hurricane that went over there, Black Americans with their own steamship, own planes, own everything, sending aid back to Jamaica. And we trading back and forth, making our own money. The Black Caribbeans and the American Blacks and the UK Blacks and the African Blacks. Could you just imagine? But what we doing? Sitting here on YouTube talking, including myself. He claimed a global mandate for African redemption, where most U.S. activists focus on civil rights within America. Garvey emphasized nationhood, not integration. And that's where the rift between him and W.e. Du Bois was. W.e. Du Bois, NAACP, and a lot of those Black people in the civil rights, they want to integrate with white people. Marcus Garvey said, fuck that. Let's make our own shit and be our own thing. He presented Africa as the spiritual and political homeland of all Black people and saw liberation as a worldwide mission well beyond U.S. racial politics. He established a parallel civilization. Garvey organized a complete government in writing, uniform UNI African Legion, a women's auxiliary, Black Cross nurses. What? Negro newspaper, schools and cooperatives. He came up with a woman's auxiliary? Let's go look up that. Woman's auxiliary. Black. Marcus Garvey. Garvey, Black nurses, Black Cross nurses. Yo, check this shit out. Check this shit out. And this nigga that was commenting to me in my chat that I'll show you earlier, he talking about, oh, you just copying and pasting from AI. Well, when you go to Google search and you punch something into Google search, it's AI. Google search has been an AI database for how long? And then look what it shows you. When you type stuff into Google search, It gives you the sources. Look at what Marcus Garvey did. The Black Cross Nurses was an auxiliary of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, modeled after the Red Cross. They provided essential health and hygiene education, first aid, and medical support to Black communities, which are often underserved by mainstream institutions. This initiative was a response to the lack of access to proper health care for Black people driven by systematic racism and exclusionary policies in nursing schools. Purpose and activity, because I'm pissed. Health and hygiene education taught proper nutrition, hygiene, and public health to community members, provided first aid, assisted with maternity cases, and visited the sick in their homes or hospitals. Extended their efforts to include youth programs, food and clothing distribution, and the creation of bandages for the Ethiopian armed forces during the Italo-Abyssinian War. And Marcus Garvey. W. Du Bois called Marcus Garvey the most dangerous Negro to the Negro race. That's what he called him. Doing this was a problem for W. Du Bois. Look! Now that Black people are integrated with white people, are we getting proper serving? Are we getting proper health treatment? Don't we always complain about, man, we afraid to go to the doctor because the white man gonna operate and take shit from us? Well, Marcus Garvey had a solution. Bridging healthcare gaps to address the disparity in care that Black people face due to, whatever. Schools and cooperatives. Newspaper, Negro World. He spoke directly to colonized Africans. Garvey's speeches reached British and French-ruled Africa through newspapers, smuggled into colonies. He inspired early African independence leaders, Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Nnamdi. I can't say these names, so sorry. Decades before decolonization began, that transatlantic impact was something Black Americans at home simply couldn't replicate under Jim Crow restrictions. Symbolism of a crowned people. Garvey staged elaborate elaborate parades with titles like Provisional President of Africa, creating a psychological empire that restored dignity to a race, taught to see itself as stateless. That culture pageantry, the uniforms, flags, and world language was uniquely his vision. Marcus Garvey alone globalized Black liberation. He turned Pan-Africanism from an idea into an institution rooted in Jamaica and the Caribbean experience, and extended it worldwide, independent of U.S. Black movements, yet ultimately influencing them. So we give thanks to James Webb, but it wasn't a movement yet until Marcus Garvey turned it into a movement. Bro, James Morris Webb, 1867 to 1940. Occupation, minister, intellectual, associated with early Pan-African and Black nationalist thought. Major work, The Black Man, Father, right? So this is before Marcus Garvey movement reached its global peak, but after Garvey had already founded the UNI in 1914, right? Therefore, Webb book came out after Garvey's ideology had begun circulating, but Garvey's organization was still in its early growth stage in the United States. Marcus Garvey, 1887 to 1940. Right? So this is him founding it. Right? James Morris Webb's book echoes themes similar to Garvey's Black Pride, biblical justification for African greatness, and global view of African destiny. However, Webb's idea did not originate Garveyism. They aligned with it. Key historical evidence. Garvey's Africa for Africa's message was already being preached in Jamaica before 1919. When Webb published his work in 1919, he later joined the UNI, meaning Garvey had already established a framework and global call. Thus, Webb was influenced by Garvey's movement, not the reverse. While both James Morris Webb and Marcus Garvey advanced Black national thought, rooted in biblical and historical justification for African greatness, the unique innovation of Garvey lay in transforming these intellectual ideas into a mass global movement. Webb articulated the theology. Garvey mobilized the world. You're not taking away anything from anybody. These two are very important, right? Webb provided a religious and historical argument for African divinity and civilization. He emphasized that Africans were the original fathers of civilization through biblical lineage. This pokes a hole into that quote that says, "A nation raises no higher than a woman." Well, a civilization doesn't get created or started without the structure and vision of a man, right? That man is putting his sperm, his spark, his vision, his instructions, his structure into that woman. The woman has to then take that structure and turn what he taught her and become the nation out of her following his structure and his vision and taking his spark. But when she rebels against his vision and his structure, that's when the problem comes in. But a man can always rebuild his structure. He can always make a next structure. He can always find something else, right? So where women are the nations, men are the keepers and structure and starters of civilizations. Political nationalist mobilization. Garvey globalized that foundation into a real political, economic, and social movement. His look to Africa for the crowning of a black king and Africa for the Africans were calls to action, not just belief. Webb's influence was theoretical, shaped thinking. Garvey's impact was practical and organizational. Shaped nations, inspired leaders. Kwame, I can't say their name, so sorry. I can say Elijah Muhammad, right? Jomo Kenyatta, all these people. All right. So this is Marcus Garvey. This is his family background. Grew up witnessing the economic struggles and social discrimination faced by Black Jamaicans under British colonial rule. Influenced early by stories of African pride, resistance, and Black historical figures. Basic schooling in Jamaica, later studied in Kingston, exposed to books and periodicals emphasizing Black history, African civilization, and Pan-African ideas. Developed a strong sense of racial pride and the idea that Black people need to assert themselves politically and economically. Garvey's child was shaped his worldwide before his American experience. Worked as a printer and journalist in Honduras and Panama. So this is showing you how Marcus Garvey was forged before he touched America, right? Observed racism, labor exploitation, and the plight of Black workers in different countries. Learned organization skills through work with labor unions and political groups. Saw firsthand the effects of colonialism in African-descended peoples. England, 1912 to 1914. Briefly traveled to London, exposed to British imperial culture and African diaspora networks, connected with other Black intellectuals and activists, getting a global perspective on racial oppression. Returned to Jamaica in 1914. Founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Jamaica, focused on racial pride, economic independence, education, and African reparation. Repatriation. That's not reparation, it's repatriation. So it's going back to Africa, basically. Promoted Black self-reliance and identity through speeches, newspapers, and local UNI chapters, right? So Marcus Garvey's idea of Pan-Africanism was already being forged before he touched America, because he's traveling all over the Caribbean and Latin America, right? Influence in Jamaica. Before entering the U.S., Garvey already had significant influence. Pan-African thought leader, advocated for African redemption in Africa for Africans, drew inspiration from Ethiopianism, biblical prophecy, and Caribbean Black intellectuals. Organizer and educator, founded local UNI chapters in Kingston, established a newspaper to communicate his ideas, early precursor to Negro World, promoted literacy, economic uplift, and self-confidence amongst Jamaican Blacks. Symbolic leadership. Presented himself as a Black king in waiting, a figure of pride and hope. Used ceremonial imagery and speeches to inspire racial unity and empowerment. Global vision seated. But working in Jamaica, Central America, and England, he developed a diaspora consciousness. Understood that Black people would be people everywhere. Needed unity, economic power, and political organization. Conclusion. Garvey before America. Before coming to the United States in 1916, Marcus Garvey was already a leader, organizer, and symbol of Black empowerment in Jamaica and the Caribbean. His ideas were deeply influenced by Ethiopianism, biblical prophecy, and Pan-African intellects, but he was translating them into practical action, forming organizations, spreading literacy, and advocating economic self-reliance. This Jamaican foundation prepared him to globalize his movement in the U.S., giving rise to the international UNI network. Right? So this is this. African pride and historical reclamation. Black people are the original civilization builders of the world. Right? How many of y'all was saying that before Marcus Garvey? Did you even believe that? I bet you a lot of the NAACP didn't believe that at the time. W. Du Bois didn't believe that at the time. W. Du Bois and a lot of those civil rights people wanted to integrate with white America. Right? Black people in the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa shared a common destiny. Political, economic, and cultural unity was essential to resist oppression. Africans must own their own business, banks, trade lines, and infrastructure. Economic independence was as important as political freedom. What was wrong with that? I don't understand. What was wrong with that? If I could ask W. Du Bois, I would ask him what was wrong with this idea. What was so better about the white man's seat and table and the food he was eating that you didn't want to create your own table and create your own shit? Books and writings that shaped him, right? Pan-African Ethiopianism texts, Blandon's essay and lectures on African civilization and diaspora responsibility, Turner's sermons and writings advocating African reparation and spiritual leadership, texts about African empires, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mali, and the achievements of Black civilization. Caribbean writers emphasizing the connection between Africa and the diaspora. Negro World, he later funded before that, read earlier Caribbean and U.S. Black newspapers, right? So we read this part properly. Negro World, he later funded before that, read earlier Caribbean and U.S. Black newspapers. Articles circulating among the Caribbean intellectuals Asia promoting Black pride and anti-colonial ideas, economic and self-determination. Biblical texts, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Cush reference, Psalm 68, verse 31, Isaiah 18, Zephaniah 3, verse 10, inspired the theological foundation of African redemption that Garvey later politicized. How Garvey synthesized these influences. Unlike prior thinkers, Garvey turned intellectual ideas into organizational action. He combined Ethiopianism, religious prophecy, Webb Turner, Pan-African political philosophy, blending Cromwell, Delaney, that's our economic pragmatism, business trade, shipping lines. This synthesis allowed him to create the UNIA, a mass movement vehicle that was both symbolic and practical, uniting people globally under the banner of African pride and empowerment. So this is Leonard P. Howe and his influence. So we're going to go into this stage, right? Because the same dude in the comment section, he said that Leonard P. Howe, he was inspired by, Black Americans. So let's go into it. First, let me go set the stage right quick. I love how people lie. Share this thread. So Black Americans, you're becoming like the you-know-who's. Right? Because you tell half-truths and don't tell the full story. Howe explicitly drew inspiration from Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born leader of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey's teaching emphasized Black pride, self-reliance, and the eventual return to Africa. Howe saw Garvey not just as a political leader, but as a prophetic figure, framing Garvey's message as a spiritual and moral foundation for his own teachings. Scholars like Barry Chavanez note that Howe credited Garvey and the UNIA for awakening his understanding of Black dignity and destiny, which became central to the Rastafari message. Howe's writings, The Promise Key, and his path, Howe lays out his vision of Rastafari movement. The text shows direct line from UNI ideology, the uplift of Black people, recognizing of Africa as a spiritual homeland and resistance to colonial and racial oppression. Howe integrates Garveyite rhetoric with religious symbolism, portraying Haile Selassie, then the Emperor of Ethiopia, as a divinely appointed figure in fulfillment of Black prophecy. Philosophical and cultural influence. Howe was inspired by Black American thought and activism, not just Jamaican politics. The combination of Garveyite ideology, his own religious interpretation, and the lived experience of Black oppression in Jamaica led Howe to found Rastafari as both spiritual and socio-political movement. This positioned Rastafari as a continuation of the evolution of Garvey's work, translating political nationalism into a spiritual framework that could unite Black people globally. Right? Being U.S., Central America, and Africa. While it originated with Garvey and Jamaican grew, so UNI's primary source, right? The UNIA founded by Garvey and had branches across the Caribbean, the U.S., Central America, and Africa. While it originated with Garvey in Jamaica and grew in the U.S., its membership was very diverse. Many were Caribbean blacks living in the U.S. or returning migrants. However, exposure to Garvey ideas largely came through UNI pamphlets, speeches, and local Jamaican chapters. Key UNI ideas he absorbed included Black pride and self-respect, economic and political self-reliance, Africa as a spiritual and ancestral homeland. So how well did it need to interact directly with Black Americans in the U.S. to absorb these ideas? The UNI and IA brought Garvey's ideology to Jamaica and the Caribbean. There was some indirect influence, so maybe he might be right, bro, right? Maybe the brother might be right. There were some indirect influences from Black Americans because the UNI was based in Harlem, New York, and Garvey's writings and speeches were widely circulated in the U.S. and the Caribbean. African American ideas about civil rights, racial uplift, and Black dignity were part of the UNI's intellectual movement. However, Howard's personal knowledge and adaptation of Rastafari were filtered through the UNIA, not directly lifted from American activists outside Garvey's network. And I'm going to expose how a lot of Black Americans did not accept the Marcus Garvey movement. As a matter of fact, if you go watch the movie Hoodlum, what was his name? Bumpy Johnson. In the movie Hoodlum, Bumpy Johnson, he didn't like the idea of going back to How That's Africa. Go watch the movie. As a matter of fact, if you watch Harlem Nights, Hoodlum, and a lot of those old movies, they talk to you about the Caribbean influence in Harlem. What was the name of the Madam Queen in Hoodlum that Bumpy Johnson was trying to defend and took back Harlem to give back to? What was her name? I think she was Haitian or Creole. And she had a bodyguard that was Caribbean. Go watch back those movies. Primary influence, the UNIA, Caribbean plus American membership, but international in scope. Secondary influence, ideas circulating in Black American communities, mainly through Garvey's writings and the UNI network. Howell synthesized these into a new spiritual movement combining Garveyite political ideology with religious prophecy, which became Rastafari. All right. All right. So so I'm not going to take away from James Webb. So this is it, right? Webb as the prophet, role, intellectual and spiritual forerunner, contribution, articulate the theology of African greatness, the prophecy of a Black king and the divine significance of African civilization. Function, provided the scriptural and philosophical foundation, the vision of liberation, dignity, and diaspora unity. Analogy, like Moses, Elijah, or John the Baptist, laying the groundwork, delivering the vision, but not the ultimate fulfillment. Garvey as the Christ figure, role, the practical embodiment and organizer of the vision. Contribution, transform the theological ideas into a global actionable movement. UNIA, Black Star Line, parades, newspapers. Function, gave the prophecy a tangible real-world form, a movement that the United Diaspora economically, politically, and culturally. Well, let me read that properly, my fault. Gave the prophecy a tangible real-world form, a movement that united the diaspora economically, politically, and culturally. Unique submission. Garvey's authority was mass movement orientated, not just intellectual or spiritual. He fulfilled Webb's vision through action, not only through doctrine. Analogy, like Christ fulfilling the Old Testament prophets. The promise and vision became reality in a new and transformative way, unique to the person and the context. Lineage matters. Webb's work gave Garvey intellectual and theological legitimacy, like prophets preparing the way. Unique agency. Garvey's contribution cannot be reduced to Webb's influence. He operationalized the vision, making it global. Vision versus action. Webb provided the conceptual blueprint. Garvey provided the living structure and movement. That's for fulfillment. Garvey's submission was unique because he mobilized an entire people, connecting the Caribbean, Africa, and the U.S. in a way no previous thinker did. So credit is due, but you still got to give the individual spirit for his unique innovation and identity that he added to the space. So anyway, this is Kish Yardy Gaming Nation or Kish Yardy Views and Vlogs. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And stay tuned for more videos like this.